Hello everybody. This tutorial is about developing and deploying apps for Google App Engine using a combination of Scala and Java. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, Google App Engine is what is known as a platform as a service that lets you run your web apps over Google's auto-scaling infrastructure. You can specify your own domain name using Google Apps, or you can use a free name on the appspot.com domain. Now, the great part about Google App Engine and really all platform as a service products is that they allow developers to focus on developing and innovating without having to worry about other web related tasks like server maintenance. Google App Engine currently has three different implementations: Python, Java, and Go. Obviously, this tutorial uses the Java implementation, and the beauty of this is that languages with JVM compatible compilers, like Scala, can be run with very little extra effort on the developer's end. One important piece of information to note before we begin is the fact that the Google App Engine environment is tightly sandboxed to allow it to scale your app accordingly. Now, this introduces some restrictions, like not being able to write to the file system. And if these restrictions are going to negatively affect your app, you might reconsider using Google App Engine. Alright, enough intro, let's get going already. Now, before we begin, you need to make sure that you have the necessary software installed. To use the Java implementation of Google App Engine, you need to download both the Java Developer Kit and the App Engine Java SDK. Now you should have Java 7 if you can, as support for Java 6 is being deprecated and will soon no longer be supported. As you can see, I have Java 7 installed. If you wish to follow along exactly with this tutorial, you also need to go grab Scala as well. Now, I will be using Scala version 2.10.1. Now, the other piece of information that you need to install is a tool to help you accomplish the multiple development and deployment tasks common to Google App Engine development. There are multiple options here, including a Google plugin for the Eclipse IDE and two different command line tools, Apache Ant and Apache Maven. Now in my documentation, I go into detail on using Apache Ant, as that is the build tool that will be used throughout the tutorial, and it's a really easy to use tool. Now once you have installed Apache Ant, you simply need to create a build.xml file with your project to configure how Ant will be used within that project. The version of Ant that I will be using is version 1.9.0. Now, before we get into the code examples, I just want to make sure that you understand the directory structure that Google App Engine is expecting. The format used is the WAR format, and it has a very simple structure. The top level directory is aptly named WAR, and inside of this directory you have a directory called web-inf, as well as any resource files that your app needs. You might, for example, create a directory called images for your app's images, or maybe style sheets for the CSS files that your app uses. Inside of the web-inf directory, there are two directories that should together contain all of the class files and jars that your app needs: a classes directory for your app's specific class files, and a lib directory for any jars that your app needs while executing. Any configuration files, such as the deployment descriptor or app engine config file, are also placed inside of the web-inf directory. Okay, now let's jump into a quick code example so you can see all of these pieces working together. This simple app is the obligatory Hello World app with a small addition to get you started using some Google App Engine APIs. Now, the first file we will look at is the build.xml file that is used to configure Apache Ant. As I mentioned, I do have some documentation that covers all of this in greater detail, so I'll keep this discussion on the video brief, and you can refer to the documentation for the details. Now, inside of this build.xml file, I've defined a few different targets, which are the commands that Ant will be able to run at the command line. The copy jars target copies the jars that this app will need to the lib directory, namely the App Engine jars and the Scala jars. Now you can see up here we've defined the lib directory as war/webinf/lib as Google App Engine expects. Likewise, the build directory, the source directory, and so on. The compile target will copy all of the .scala files in the project's source directory into the build directory, copying over any other files that might exist without compiling them. By making the compile target depend on the copy jars target, you will ensure that the jars in the lib directory are the most up-to-date copy you have installed before compiling your code. For example, if you update them for a new version or something along those lines. Now you can see that the compile target also depends on the init target. Now, the init target sets up dependencies for using Scala with Ant and is therefore required for this project. Finally, the run server target first executes the compiled target and then starts up the development server on port 8888. The next file to examine is the deployment descriptor file. This is where you map the routes of your app to specific URLs and place authentication restrictions on certain URLs within your app. You can see here that we have one servlet named Hello World mapped to the URL /Hello World, and that we have included this servlet on the welcome file list. This means that this servlet will be displayed when users visit the root URL of your app. Next, we have the App Engine config file. For this demo app, this file really has no meaningful information, but this is where you would put your app's registered ID and version number. The thread safe parameter tells Google App Engine whether or not to allow concurrent requests for your app. You can also set things like which files are resource files, which files are static files, set cache timeouts for your static files, and much more. Now, the servlet for this code is quite simple, but this is where the small addition comes in. The servlet uses the Google Users service to allow users to sign in with a Google account. Once they have signed in, the app displays a simple welcome message on their screen. Let's see this app in action. We can copy all of the necessary jars, compile our servlet code, and launch the development server with a single command. Ant run server. Now you can see all of the targets that we defined in our build.xml file are executed in the order that we specified. And finally, the development server is launched. Upon visiting the development server in the browser, we are redirected and prompted to log in. But wait, we don't even need a password. This is because the development server lets you use the Google User Service without needing to log in with any real accounts, so you can easily switch between a regular user account and an administrator account. Once we enter in a random email address, we see the welcome message.